Hello everyone, it's Mr. Moomaw again, welcoming you to another episode of Mr. Moomaw Talks About U.S. History. I just want to say hello to everyone at Oceanside Collegiate Academy. Hello Ms. Hahn, hello Ms. McCall, how are you doing? Welcome back everyone. Sorry about the t-shirt, it's casual Friday, Sunday, whatever. But I want to say I'm very happy to be back with you all again. Hopefully, what it's looking like right now is that I will actually be down there on Thursday in person to meet you all, which I'm very much looking forward to. So to dive right in, last time we talked about the Americas, the peopling of the Americas, people coming over from Asia, settling, wiping out all the Pleistocene megafauna. We talked about Europeans, we talked about Leif Erikson, we talked about Columbus, we talked about Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. And today I want to build on that and transition to where we're actually talking about the establishment of the United States. And the Spanish are a great place to move on from that, because that's where the direct connection with the English comes in. The English, of course, are going to be the ones who settle most of North America, and that's where the United States ultimately comes from. So to begin with, we know about the Spanish. They conquered the mighty Aztec civilization, they conquered the great Inca civilization, and they looted and pillaged them just terribly. All that gold and all that silver. And they take all that gold and all that silver, and pretty much all of it just gets shipped right back to Spain. Which means you've got a whole bunch of cargo ships moving across the Atlantic, sailing along slowly, just loaded down heavily with gold and silver. And what that means is, people get attracted to that. What's the only thing easier than going in and stealing gold from the Aztecs? Waiting until the Spanish steal it and steal it from them. So a lot of pirates get involved. Now some of these are your standard Black Flag, Johnny Depp style pirates. But the real pirates, the important ones that we're going to talk about here, are the licensed pirates, the privateers. I don't know if you guys know this, governments back then, and technically they can still do this, governments can issue something called a letter of marque and reprisal, which basically allows a ship captain to attack another nation's ships and take their stuff. In other words, say a war breaks out, government doesn't have a big navy. So what they'll do is captains come in and say, hey, I want one of these letters of marque and reprisal. They get a letter of marque and reprisal, and then they are allowed to go out and attack the commercial shipping of any country with which you're at war. And you get to keep it. If America goes to war with England, you get these licensed pirates, they go out and attack shipping, and then they get to keep whatever they find. So it's a pretty good deal for everybody. The government gets a sort of cheap volunteer navy, as it were, and the ship captains get all the loot. Now these licensed pirates, they're known as privateers. And what you see in the wake of the Spanish conquest of the New World are a bunch of English privateers. England and Spain, they are not close. We were going into the history of England in the 16th century. You would see that there's back and forth, religious disputes, whether England's going to stay at the Anglican Church, whether it's going to go to be a Calvinist church, or whether it's going to go back to Roman Catholicism. And Spain is very heavily involved in all this. The English government, after Queen Mary dies and Queen Elizabeth takes over, is very hostile to Spain. And so they're perfectly happy to license these people to go out and attack Spanish shipping, despite the fact England is not yet at war with Spain. This is an important point. This first generation of licensed pirates that goes out and attacks Spanish shipping, they're doing this sort of secretly. They're not openly at war, which means that these guys were to get caught, they basically get disavowed by their government. Now, these licensed pirates, these are not just people going off on their own. These guys typically have backing from very wealthy people, including the Queen herself. And the most important of these licensed pirates is a guy named Francis Drake. Francis Drake is literally born on a ship. He's a strict Calvinist. He grew up during the time when the government's trying to bring England back to the Catholic Church. He's persecuted, has a just fanatical hatred of Catholicism, and is also an excellent sailor. Well, he gets a bunch of wealthy backers, including the Queen herself, and Francis Drake goes to work. He sails to the Caribbean, attacks Spanish shipping, makes his way down the coast of South America, just looting and pillaging his heart's content. Now the Spanish are waiting for him to come back. The Spanish are thinking, oh, Francis Drake, he's going to have to sort of turn around and go back to Europe, so we'll cut him off there in the middle of the Atlantic. Francis Drake doesn't do this, though. Francis Drake is a very bold man. Francis Drake, instead of going back to Europe, sails down the coast around Tierra del Fuego in the bottom of South America, and then back up north into the Pacific. The Spanish are active in the Pacific. Of course, we know the Spanish at this point have established control of the Philippine Islands. But there's no navy there. The Spanish aren't afraid of anyone. The English aren't active in the Pacific yet. So Francis Drake is just out there with his warship, and he's the only guy with guns, basically. So Francis Drake just has the time of his life, just destroying all these Spanish ships, taking all the stuff. And he makes his way back. He sails around Africa, back north, and makes his way back to England. Very, very rich. Makes all his investors rich. The Queen of England knights him. He makes him a knight. Well, the English now are involved in the Spanish New World, attacking it basically. But in order to further that end, they people start to think, well, maybe we should put some kind of colony, some kind of station in the New World to the north of the Spanish. The English, for various reasons, have claimed everything, North America. Why don't we put something there? And then the idea kind of evolved from there to, maybe it would just be a good idea in general to colonize the New World. That's where you first start to see this concept, the actual phrase, British Empire. People like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's personal wizard. I'm not making that up, she had a wizard. Her personal wizard comes up with this idea. And in John Dee's circle, in these elite court circles where people are planning this new British Empire, one of the most important and interesting figures is this gentleman right here, Walter Raleigh. And, Raleigh, North Carolina. Walter Raleigh is a Renaissance man. Now, you guys may have heard the term Renaissance man before. Renaissance man is someone who's good at tons of things. And I'm not talking about fixing toilets and putting on horseshoes or something like that. The gentlemanly arts. A Renaissance man, first and foremost, is a scholar. Your Greek and your Latin. Typically, you're in modern continental languages like French and Italian, things like that. Walter Raleigh is a historian. Later in his life, when he's in the Tower of London getting ready to be executed, he actually writes a history of the world, a very interesting one. He's a scientist. He does work with fire, determining how to, the weight of something going by ashes, things like that. He's a soldier. He helps put down revolts in Ireland, so he's got experience pacifying native populations. A lot of these guys are going to have that. That's going to be a big deal later on. Pardon me, sorry. But more than anything, he's a dreamer. He likes this idea of a British Empire. He likes the idea of England expanding out. So Walter Raleigh takes the initiative and founds a colony in what is the border between Virginia and North Carolina, known as Roanoke. Ship all these people over, they build Roanoke. Now, Roanoke doesn't do well at first. Partly because they can't really decide what the main purpose of Roanoke is. Is Roanoke supposed to be a way station to attack Spanish shipping? Are we supposed to be exploring inland looking for Indians to loot for gold like the Spanish did? Are we actually trying to build a real sustainable colony? The purpose is kind of unclear, which can cloud any endeavor. It's not self-sustaining. They have to keep shipping in supplies, shipping in people die. You're talking about 1585. By the time 1588 rolls around, the Spanish and English are now at war. Go figure. The English government says no ships can leave England. We need them all here for the war. And it's not until 1590 that anybody can get back to Roanoke. And when they get back to Roanoke, no one's there. The colony is just abandoned. It's gone. People just poof, disappeared. What happened to them? No one knows. The only evidence, it looks like people just up and left. It doesn't look like they were attacked by Indians there, at least, because all the stuff in Roanoke that Indians would probably loot, mirrors and metal tools and things like that, are still there. On one of the trees, someone has carved the word Croatoan, which is both the name of a local Indian tribe and a nearby island. Did that mean they were attacked somehow by these people? There's no evidence of it. Does it mean they left and decided to go and live on Croatoan or go and live with the Croatoan people? Does it mean anything? Maybe somebody just carved that for fun. Could they have tried to build a ship themselves and sail back to England? Possibly. They would all got on the ship. Ship wasn't very good and sank. Nobody knows. But it just goes to show how perilous this New World colonization really is. You're taking your life in your hands when you go to the New World. This is not for the faint of heart. It is not a forgiving place. The New World eats the unready and the unlucky. Walter Raleigh, I should mention, he's not there. Walter Raleigh's back in England masterminding all this stuff. But it is a failure. And it just goes, again, I can't stress this enough. Colonization is not an easy thing. Now, Walter Raleigh does a lot of this himself, puts a lot of his own money into it and things like that. But that's not going to be the pattern with future English settlement in North America. This is a key point, and it's something that's going to come up as we talk about the revolution, and we get to the prelude to revolution and the revolution. English settlement in North America is very different than French settlement, Spanish settlement, Portuguese settlement, Dutch, everybody else. All those other colonization plans involve governing from the mother country. New Spain is run from Spain by Spaniards. You can be of full Spanish descent, 100% of European descent, but if you are born in Mexico, you have no share in power whatsoever. Every government official comes from Spain. And it's tightly controlled, and it's run in the interest of the mother country. There's no attempt to develop a domestic economy, domestic governing institutions, nothing like that. English colonies are different. From the beginning, almost all of these colonies are self-governing. Typically what you see, actually universally see, this idea of a charter. Everybody who settles, every group that comes over gets a charter from the government, which basically outlines the colonizer, whether it's a single person, a proprietary colony, or just sort of kind of corporate enterprise, like they call a charter colony, like the Virginia Company, things like that. No matter what it is, though, these colonies are generally given the ability to govern themselves. They make their own laws, they set their own tax rates, they raise their own militia. That's very important. By the time the American Revolution comes along, these colonies have sometimes 2 centuries of experience governing themselves. Unlike all these other places we're going to talk about, they get their independence. You with me on that? Good. All right. So, the English try again. In 1607, you get the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company, kind of a proto-corporation. What we would call today what they called back then, a joint stock company. Basically a group of investors, everybody owns a piece of this investment. And how they make their money is basically they go to the government and say, hey, we want to, I'm using modern terms for this, kind of like a contract, as it were, to settle the new world. You let us dispose of all this land within a certain span of latitudes, somewhere in there. And we'll sell land out and everything, settle it, make sure it's producing something valuable. We get a cut of everything. It's a business venture. America is a place where people go to make money. And the Virginia Company gets a group of settlers together. They send them over, and they land in what's today Virginia. Although bear in mind, the word Virginia back then was much more all-encompassing. Virginia was, depending when you're talking about, all the English territories, the New World, everything from New England all the way down to what's today South Carolina. That it varies in terms of what Virginia means back then. But what I'm talking about right here is the modern state of Virginia. Jamestown is founded at the mouth of what they call the James River in modern day Virginia. Now, Jamestown is not in a good location. It's built actually kind of in a malarial swamp. It's basically at first just kind of an overgrown fort. Nobody really knows much about where to put a city because none of the people who come over have any experience whatsoever with building cities, colonization. Again, you've got this kind of ill-defined purpose with this colony. A lot of the people that come over are gentlemen. They're people who are sort of minor aristocrats from the landowning families, and they're looking for gold. They think they're going to go over and just dig the dirt and gold's going to come up. Or they'll be able to attack the local Indians and get a bunch of gold. They're looking to get rich. These are not farmers. These are not carpenters. These are not people with practical skills that you need to survive in a wilderness. Which means that very quickly after they build Jamestown, everybody starts dying. To make things worse, Jamestown, quite unbeknownst to all these settlers, has been set up smack in the middle of the vast Powhatan Confederacy. An Indian tribe known as the Powhatan have conquered or dominated all of these other surrounding tribes into a sort of mini empire, actually a pretty powerful empire. And Jamestown just right smack in the middle of that. It's as if someone just showed up on the beach and built a town and had no idea Charleston was 5 miles down the road and they were in the state of South Carolina. So things aren't going very well for Jamestown at first. Now, things begin to look up for them when you get John Smith coming into the picture. John Smith comes over in the first wave of settlers. Unlike the rest of them, he has practical experience in something. John Smith is a soldier. He's used to commanding people. So John Smith ends up organizing this colony basically under martial law, forces everybody to work, they plant food. John Smith also takes the initiative, establishes diplomatic relations with the Powhatan. Very famously, there's John Smith and Pocahontas. Supposedly John Smith's out exploring one day, gets captured by the Powhatan. They pull him into the Great Lodge. They're about to bash his brains out with a war club, and all of a sudden Pocahontas just throws herself, no, don't kill him, Did that actually happen? Maybe. John Smith told a similar story about being captured by the Turks. Like I say, he was a soldier, he fought all over the place. He told a similar story about being captured by the Turks, so maybe he just kind of conflated the two in his memory. Things like this did happen. This might have just been a scare tactic. You bring in John Smith, you get this huge, great lodge. All the people in the village are there staring at you. It's this very scary scene. They lay you out. You think you're about to die, and all of a sudden there's this reprieve. Pocahontas saves you, and thus, in a weird way, you feel grateful to the Powhatan for not killing you. Kind of a Stockholm syndrome, I guess, thing before the word. So possibly happened. One thing that did not happen, that everybody loves, Disney movies love, everybody loves this idea that John Smith and Pocahontas had this relationship. There was no evidence whatsoever of that. I mean, just dash your fantasies about that. John Smith wrote extensively about his days in the New World, wrote about Pocahontas. In no way, shape, or form does he mention any sort of relationship whatsoever between them. Now, Pocahontas does, however, form a relationship with the Jamestown settlement. She comes to live in Jamestown. Well, actually, they kidnap her first, but then she ends up just deciding to stay. She gets baptized. They baptize her Rebecca. So she was Pocahontas, now she's Rebecca. And she ends up getting married to one of the settlers, a guy named John Rolfe. John Rolfe, he came over from England, settled in the Caribbean for a little while, I believe Bermuda. His family, while he's there, dies. While he was there, he learned about tobacco cultivation. So when he lands in Jamestown, I guess he's trying to get away from all that. He lands in Jamestown, and he sets to work cultivating a new strain of tobacco. He crossbreeds the Caribbean tobacco with the local Virginia tobacco, and they mix them together and produce a strain of tobacco that smokes as well as the Caribbean kind, but will grow as far north as Virginia. Plants it, harvests it, ships it back to England, makes a bunch of money. Turns out there really is gold under the soil. It's just green and brown gold, not the gold color kind. John Rolfe, like I said, gets wealthy off of this. He ends up marrying Rebecca, formerly Pocahontas. She now is Rebecca Rolfe. He takes her back to England. This is a picture of her, actually, right here. And I know you can't read it from where you are, but in Latin, the phrase around here basically says something like, Rebecca, the daughter of the king of the Powhatan, basically, or Princess Pocahontas, Princess Rebecca. For John Rolfe, he's very much marrying up. He has this idea that he's moving up in the world by marrying Pocahontas. He doesn't see her as this sort of primitive savage. He sees her as a noble. They have a son, by the way, a guy named Thomas Rolfe. She dies in England, unfortunately, of disease, but he brings Thomas Rolfe back. And in Virginia, the oldest families in Virginia, one of their points of pride is being descended from Thomas Rolfe. Now, as far as tobacco goes, now that John Rolfe is making money off tobacco, everybody else wants to make money off tobacco too. Problem is, as we talked about with the Caribbean, tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. So where's your workforce going to come from? Well, you start off indentured servants. Indentured servant is basically a contract laborer. I'm in England, I want to come over to the New World. I don't need money to pay the ship captain to take me over. What do? I sign a contract with the ship's captain for, say, 7 years of labor in return for passage. He takes that contract, we sail across. The captain gets off at the dock in the New World and says, hey guys, I got a bunch of contracts. Who wants to buy somebody's labor for 7 years? And the local farmers will say, I'll buy this one, I'll buy that one. So the captain basically sells your labor. Your labor is a commodity. He sells your labor to these farmers. Now, indentured servants are a feature of colonial life. In fact, something like 70% of people who come over from Europe come over as indentured servants. Problem is, it's not a steady, long-term labor force, after all. First of all, you run away. If you can, why would you stick around and work for somebody else when you can start your own tobacco plantation? But also, even when you're done, you work your 7 years, you're free, you move down the road, you set up your own plantation, now you're competing against the guy who you formerly worked for. So, what the colonists go with is a for them, better, more permanent solution, which is to say, African slaves. Slavery is a part of America from the very beginning. The first slave ship shows up in Jamestown in 1619. And slavery will remain a part of American society, the American economy, all the way up into 1865, 1866, when the 13th Amendment is passed ending slavery. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the South, in the southern colonies, forget I said South, that's a term that's much later, ignore the word South. In the southern colonies, the pattern of the economic system established in Jamestown, large-scale plantation agriculture, becomes the norm. As new colonies are established in the south, and as they spread west, they spread as these plantation societies. The economy, political system is dominated by these large plantation owners. And bear in mind, a plantation is not a family farm. It is a commercial enterprise. It is a big business. Most Southerners aren't going to own these huge plantations and all these slaves, of course. It's a small number of very wealthy people who dominate everything. But that is the economic mainstay. That's true of the southern colonies. Now, when you get to the north, things are very different for all kinds of reasons. These guys are Puritans. We talked about them already. Puritans, Calvinists in general. What do we know about Calvinists? We know the tulip thing we always talk about when we talk about Calvinism. If you study religion in college, you'll hear the TULIP acronym, total depravity, and so on down the line. But these Calvinists, remember, they believe in that double predestination. They believe that God not only knows who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned, but God himself, before the beginning of time, before anything was even created, had chose who he was going to pluck from damnation and who he was going to allow to be damned for his own unknowable reasons. So there's a community of the elect. There are the people God has elected to pull out of damnation, which is the natural course for humans. Humans don't have free will. We had free will before the fall, before Adam and Eve disobeyed God, but now our free will is so clouded by our depravity that we cannot even choose to be good. God has to pick us. In England, Calvinism manifests two ways. One, they're the people who want nothing to do with the Church of England. Remember, in England at this time, everyone by law has to belong to the Church of England. They had so many religious conflicts during the 16th century that as the 17th century rolls around, the English government says basically everybody's got to belong. No more Catholics, no more Calvinists, everybody belongs to this sort of middle-of-the-road church we've constructed. Catholics obviously don't want to belong to, we're going to talk about them in a minute. But the Calvinists don't want to either. And there's two ways they go about this. There are first of all the people who just say, I want to be separate. I don't want to have anything to do with the Church of England. I want to form my own congregation, have no association whatsoever. These are separatists. One group of these separatists is known as the Scrooby Congregation. The Scrooby Congregation runs afoul of the government, as you would expect. The government harasses these people, so the Scrooby Congregation ends up picking up stakes and basically moving to Amsterdam. Amsterdam tolerates everything. The problem for these deeply religious people, though, is that Amsterdam tolerates everything. They don't want to raise their kids in Amsterdam. They want to retain their sense of Englishness. So to make a very long, complicated story very simple, these people petition the English government to be allowed to settle the New World. They hire an old wine ship called the Mayflower, and the Scrooby Congregation picks up stakes from Amsterdam, and they move to Virginia, or at least that's their plan. They actually end up way off course and land much further north in Massachusetts Bay. In fact, they're unclear whether they even have the legal right to settle there. So while they're on the Mayflower, they write a set of laws to govern themselves until they can sort the legal situation out. The famous Mayflower Compact. This is an important document in American history, and again illustrates the fact that these colonies have the idea of self-governing right from the start. Well, these, and of course the people we're talking about are the Pilgrims. These Pilgrims set up a colony known as Plymouth in Massachusetts Bay, and Thanksgiving and all that. Now the other group of these Calvinists in England are known as the Puritans. We've seen them before. We talked about John Winthrop. The Puritans don't want to break away from the Church of England. They want to change it, or as they would see it, fix it. They want to get rid of all that leftover Catholic stuff that the Reformation in England did not dispense with. However, they're not having a lot of success in this. So a group of these Puritans, obviously not all the Puritans, a group of them, say something basically like, well, instead of staying in England and just keep working here, why don't we go to the New World? We'll set up a colony, sort of a model colony, a city on a hill. That will be an example back in England of how a godly society can work. And then back in England, the church will change to be more Calvinist because we've obviously proven that that's what a godly society looks like, and they should be like that too. So in 1630, these guys go to America, and they land in Massachusetts Bay as well, and they set up Boston. Other colonies follow. You end up, Salem and this and that. And they end up amalgamating eventually as the Massachusetts Bay Colony and eventually the province of Massachusetts. Now, where they end up settling, far to the north of Virginia, the climate is different and thus the economy is going to be different. You don't get these big commercial farms like you have in Virginia. You don't get plantation agriculture. Don't get the idea there's no slavery. Slavery is legal in every single colony, and there are slaves in every single colony. They're just not an important part of the economy the way they are in the southern colonies. In New England, the pattern is generally small farms, everybody lives in townships, and there's a very gradual spread west, as opposed to the sprawling sort of plantations, everything far apart that you see in the southern colonies. Obviously, the mainstay of the economy, just like everywhere, is agriculture. 90% of people are still farmers. But in New England, trade becomes very important. There develops right away a big shipbuilding industry. Remember, in the Americas, there are still these vast forests. You don't have that back in Europe. All those forests were cut down in the Middle Ages for charcoal and just firewood and building houses and stuff like that. So wood is very expensive back in Europe, whereas in the New World, it's just everywhere. In fact, wood is a byproduct of having to show up and clear all this land off. Remember, hard physical work. You buy land in the New World, it's covered in trees. You got to get rid of them if you want to build a farm. Anybody ever tried to cut down a tree with an axe? You know the kind of labor I'm talking about. So you get this big shipbuilding industry right away. People are selling ships back in England that are built in the New World. With those ships, they also establish trade. They produce things, ship them back to England, bring things from England to the New World. Develop a major fishing industry, and of course a whaling industry. My own classes, when I talked about this, I never know exactly what's going to fascinate people. They really seemed interested in whaling. They wanted to know how it was done. You go out basically in a big ship, and then you have these little smaller ships alongside. When you see a pod of whales, which is like a herd of whales, you launch your small ship, you go out and you harpoon the whale. You throw this big barbed spear at him, that because it's barbed, it stays in, it doesn't pull out. And then the whale drags you along, because it's tied to a rope. He drags you along until he gets exhausted, and then you just pull up next to him and spear him to death with these big, sharp lances. Then you drag him alongside your ship and you flens him, which is to say you take these big kind of hockey stick-shaped knives and you skin him. Underneath his skin, this subcutaneous kind of fatty layer known as blubber. You can take that and render it down, which is to say you boil it and then it recondenses as this hard substance. You make soap and candles and things like that out of it. The oil, sperm whale, this big guy right here, largest predator on Earth, his head's full of oil. It has to do with, or it's got oil in it. It has to do with how they make their echolocation. Whales, that clicking sound, they know where everything is. You get that oil out of his head. The oil is extremely valuable. You burn it in lamps, industrial lubricant. It's got all kinds of uses. The bone, whale bone, can be used for a lot of things that we use plastic for today. Even women's corsets and stuff, you can use whale bone for that. The most valuable thing on a whale, though, I don't know if you know this, sperm whales eat the giant squid, the Architeuthis. They dive thousands of feet down. They eat these giant squids. And a giant squid only has one hard part on its entire body. A giant squid has a beak, like a parrot. That's how it eats. Well, sometimes the whale, they swallow this beak, it gets lodged in their intestines, and it irritates them. And so a whale's intestines produce this kind of gooey, waxy substance that will surround the beak, or whatever hard thing they happen to have in there, and basically just lump around it so it makes it smooth so it doesn't irritate them anymore. Well, if you gut the whale and you cut open his intestines and you manage to dig one of these lumps out, that waxy substance is called ambergris, and it's extremely valuable. As bad as it stinks by itself, it's actually very useful as a fixative in perfumes. You mix that stuff with rose oil or whatever, and the scent just stays for much longer than it otherwise would. Which means that gooey, waxy lump out of a whale's intestines is the most valuable thing you find on him. Nobody uses any of this stuff anymore. We have artificial substitutes for everything you get from a whale. But it is interesting that that's one of the valuable things. So that's whaling, in case you guys are as fascinated by it as my people seem to be. Now, when we talk about these colonies in the north, initially we end up with just one first, Massachusetts Bay, and then other colonies start to kind of hive off from them. These colonies are small, mainly because, remember, these people are they're there for religious reasons. These are ideological communities. These people are together because they share the same ideas. So if you don't share the same ideas, you're not really part of the same community anymore. So a lot of times people hive off and just form their own little towns because of some religious dispute. It's one of the reasons New England states are small. And you end up at the end with 4 New England states. You got Massachusetts, you got Connecticut and Rhode Island, and then you have New Hampshire. Notice I did not mention Vermont, and I did not mention Maine. Those are not independent colonies. Those will become states later on. So New England, 4 states: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Those are the 4 New England colonies. Now, when I mentioned ideological disputes, these people come together because they believe the same thing. They believe that within their community are the elect. And they have a theological background for all of this stuff. So it's not like Jamestown, where everybody's there to make money and you can tolerate differences of belief among people. In fact, in the southern colonies, beliefs aren't a big deal at all. These plantation owners spend most of their time gambling on cockfights and racing horses and getting drunk and dueling each other. The South is not known as a religious place. That will come later on. But if you want religion in America right now, you're talking about New England. But these people, they get into all kinds of arguments. And these arguments threaten the societies themselves because they are ideological. They go to the core of why they're there in the first place. This guy, for example, this is Roger Williams. Roger Williams is a Calvinist preacher. He comes over from England, sets up shop in Massachusetts Bay. But Roger Williams' preaching becomes very controversial because Roger Williams says basically, well, look, God has chosen before all time who is to be saved and who is to be damned. Nothing you can do about it. God has either chosen you or he's rejected you. You can't change that. You can't even want to change that. But if that's the case, it doesn't make any sense for us to persecute people. They can't change anybody's minds. God's either chosen them or rejected them. Therefore, somebody else's preaching, even if it's completely wrong, can't have any effect on the community. If he changes someone's mind, then that person was never meant to be saved to begin with. Therefore, we should stop all this religious persecution. Stop hanging Quakers and everything. Also, Roger Williams tells them to stop ripping off the Indians, so they don't like him for that either. They decide in the end they're going to punish Roger Williams. They basically put a death sentence on him, so and they allow him to flee. Roger Williams flees. He goes south, founds the colony of Providence, which later evolves into the Rhode Island colony. And he also takes the initiative, and this is important, we're going to hear about these people later on. He's one of the founders of the Baptist denomination in America. Later on, you'll see Brown University in Rhode Island becomes a major exporter of Baptist missionaries. There's also Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson, a woman. Anne Hutchinson goes to all the Puritan sermons, the big, long 4-hour sermons densely argued sermons these guys like to go to. She goes home and she has Bible study in her house. And Anne Hutchinson said, you can't really know who the elect are. You can know for yourself. You feel the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. You're convicted inside yourself that you've been saved, and you see God's signs operating in your life and all that. But these other people, you can't really know. And besides that, if you have been saved, if God has chosen you, God has poured his grace out upon you, then why bother with earthly laws? Why are you under the constraints of man if you have this direct relationship with God? Why do you need ministers? These are challenging things. The logic of this, if you take it to its conclusion, is basically threatening to the stability of the whole community. There's an idea called antinomianism. The idea that because you have such and such, you're such a spiritual state, that the laws of man don't apply to you. Well, Anne Hutchinson goes before they put her on trial basically, and they end up exiling her from the community. She goes to what's today New York, which is at the time run by the Dutch. The Dutch are at war with the local Indians, and the Indians end up getting Anne Hutchinson and her family and murdering all of them. Which, as you can imagine, the Puritan leaders back in Massachusetts Bay thought was just confirmation of everything they believed. See, look, Indians killed her, therefore she was wrong. These problems don't stop. These religious disputes don't go away. What you're going to see with these Puritans are a series of changes over time. The community will evolve, and how they evolve is interesting, and it's going to be a major part of American history as we move along. So it's going to be a running theme in this class. Also, I bring this up because it is a major part on the EOCT. For whatever reason, out of 60 questions, I remember looking at the first year, I can't promise it's still the case because they change it, but they ask 2 questions about the Puritan education system. And I'm not giving it away because they've changed every year. But just in case they ask all this stuff about the Puritan education system, know this. The Puritans value education very highly, much more so than they do in the southern colonies. Puritans think it's important that everybody be able to read the Bible. So at the very least, the kids should be given the rudiments of being able to read and write in English. Every town that's a certain size, they very famous Old Deluder Satan Act. The Puritans believed that every town that reaches a certain size should build a school and hire a teacher at public expense to teach the kids. Now, the education most of them get is that basic being able to read the Bible in English education. Brighter kids, though, are given the full education, which is they learn Latin, Greek, and math. That is education at the time. If you know your Latin, your Greek, and your math, you're good to go. And once you've learned those three things, you're ready for college, no matter what age you are. Basically, just once you've mastered those subjects, on to college you go for further study. Now, initially, people get sent back to England, but very quickly, in fact, in 1636, remember, Boston's only founded in 1630. 1636, they establish Harvard as a college. Harvard becomes obviously the most famous college in America, probably the top college in America, probably the top college in the world, some would say. Later on, they decide Harvard's getting a little too liberal. 1701, they found Yale. Pardon. And, this is interesting too. Here's an actual diagram. I don't know if you can see all the words from where you are. There's an actual diagram. This is the old college, 1655. They built the Indian College, which they ended up inviting over sons of Indian chiefs and stuff to educate them in English ways. And then you got the brew house. Right from the beginning, they realized that you need lots of beer in college. So they set up a brewery right next to the college to be able to provide beer for the students. And understand, beer and alcohol consumption is just a part of daily life. Everybody drinks, even relatively young kids. Everybody drinks. So, drinking and education, hand in hand. Now, obviously, as these settlements grow, as they expand west, both Jamestown and the Massachusetts Bay settlements, they run into conflicts with the natives. There's just not room for both of them. One's expanding, so one necessarily has to contract. And so they end up in conflicts. Now, please understand, when you talk about Indian wars and things, up until the end of the Civil War, you could argue that pretty much every Indian war was never just Europeans versus Indians. It's always one group of Europeans and one group of Indians versus another group of Europeans and another group of Indians. It's never just Indians versus Europeans. Hardly ever. Great example of that, Pequot War in 1636. The Pequots are people who live in Massachusetts Bay. They're resisting the expansion. It's a complicated story, I'm just making it pretty simple as I can. They're resisting Massachusetts expanding west. They ally with the Dutch, who again we talked about are in what's today New York. The Massachusetts Bay settlers form their own alliance with the Narragansett peoples, and well, what ends up happening is the Pequot go to war, and they do what the Indians do when they go to war, which is they attack settlements, they kill everybody. We talked about that endemic style warfare. They attack, they kill, loot people, they steal valuable things, mirrors, iron tools, things like that, and then they go back. The Massachusetts Bay settlers, it's very different. They form a militia, they march off to fight them. The Pequot warriors fortify up thinking, well, they're going to come fight us. But they don't. The people of the Massachusetts militia and their Indian allies go to the Pequot village, they surround it, light it on fire, and then when all the women and children and old people come out, they just shoot them all down. Then they hunt down the remnants of the Pequots over the course of the Pequot War, which goes on 2 years, and systematically destroy them. Everybody who's left they can get a hold of, they round up, put in chains, and sell as slaves in the Caribbean. No more Pequot War, no more Pequots. Very rarely, and I would say really only Tecumseh out of all the Indian leaders, almost never do the Indians realize what they're up against. The Europeans don't engage in this endemic warfare. They don't raid and go home. They just keep coming. Season after season, year after year, this relentless assault, and they just grind you into dust in this war of attrition. They keep attacking and attacking until there's nothing left but women and children starving in the wilderness. It is a style of warfare they are completely unaccustomed to. And the Europeans, with their more sophisticated agriculture and their more sophisticated economy, are able to keep large numbers of armed men in the field for far longer than any Indian group is able to do. Understand this also. The frontier is a violent place. It's just sort of understood among European people and later on the Americans that the rules don't apply there. There's things you do on the frontier that you would never do in civilized society, in civilized warfare. Massacres, mutilation of the dead, things like that. That's done on the frontier. The frontier is a violent place. Frontier warfare is brutal and nasty. I cannot stress that enough. And we're going to see this over and over again as the semester progresses. One episode that's also important for understanding these Puritans is, well, remember, they're an ideological community. They've got it figured out. They're going to build a city on a hill. They are God's chosen people. But things are going bad for them. King Philip's War, 1675. The Indians on the frontier launch a massive pan-Indian assault on Massachusetts Bay. They manage to wipe out something like 10% of the population. It is an enormous attack. And of course, it's wiped out brutally. The Indians, they don't have prisons. When they show up, they kill. They take stuff. They burn down settlements. And so the Massachusetts Bay militia goes out to fight them. And it's a very near thing. It could easily have been, especially with the people allied with the Indians, the other Europeans, it could easily have been that Massachusetts Bay was wiped off the map. Of course, they put down this fight brutally. They end up attacking King Philip, what they call King Philip, an Indian chief known as Metacom. They cut off his head and send it around to all the Indian villages. They all know he's dead. Resistance dies off. But it's a near thing. On top of that, there's a civil war in England. Calvinists end up in control of the government. So it looks like they just wasted their time coming to the New World. They could have stuck around and Calvinists would have ended up in charge anyway. Except that doesn't last. Calvinists go away and you get a Catholic sympathizing king in power. That Catholic sympathizing king, who doesn't like the Calvinists, ends up putting an Anglican bishop, a bishop of the Church of England, in Boston. So now everybody's looking around saying, what do we do? This doesn't make any sense. We're supposed to be a shining city on a hill. We're supposed to be the glory of the world. And look, we're getting murdered by Indians. Roger Williams, all these problems. They're putting an Anglican bishop in our town that we built as a Calvinist settlement. This is horrible. And since it's not our ideas, of course, we got that all figured out. We're the elect. We got the ideas. That's good. There must be some other force at work. There must be some force within sabotaging us. Someone among us who's against us. And thus you end up with these witch trials. And the story behind it's kind of complicated. I had a professor when I was an undergraduate who specialized in Salem witch trials. He could tell you all about it. Very fascinating guy. Basically, there was a group of girls, 1692. One of the local pastors had a slave, a woman from the Caribbean named as Tituba. Tituba was telling all the kids stories, and they got into their heads that they were possessed. So they were acting, they were saying they were possessed by the devil. They went to Tituba, because they all blamed Tituba. They sat her down and said, "Tituba, are you a witch?" And Tituba very cleverly said, "Oh, yeah, I'm a witch. Sorry, I confess. My bad. Totally bad." Because of course she knew what would happen if she didn't. They just tortured out of her. So they said, "Okay, Tituba, you're a witch. How did you become a witch? Where'd you get your power?" She said, "Oh, well, I went off in the woods where the devil lives. Everybody knows the devil lives in the woods with the Indians. So he goes off and went off in the woods, and I signed the devil's book." Okay, wow, he signed the devil's book. Wait. Who else's name was in there? And Tituba, again, cleverly for herself at least, starts naming names. So they start arresting people en masse. They end up hanging 19 people and crushing one guy to death with stones to try to extort a confession from him. This goes on for about a year and a half until finally the government steps in and just puts a halt to it. And then everybody's sort of posthumously exonerated. Everybody realizes right away they went too far with this and none of these people were actual witches. Except Cotton Mather, but that's something else. This is something you see in ideological communities. We're going to see this later on in American history. We're good, so somebody must be working against us from within. We're going to see this with the French Revolution. We're going to see this with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Our idea is perfect. We figured out history. We know what's going to happen. So, somebody must be working within us. Saboteur, Trotskyites, Wrecker, something like that. So we got to just have these mass trials and wipe them out. Now, other colonies are coming into being even as all these events are happening. Now, remember I talked about those Catholics in England. Well, to make, again, a very complicated story short, because I'm trying to get through all 13 colonies here. The King of England, he's sympathetic to Catholics. In 1632, there's actually nobles, very prominent people who are Catholics. So to help them out and to get as many of them out of England as he could, America, please understand, is a dumping ground for people nobody wants in England. Sure, a lot of people come over who have things going on, who just want to get richer or whatever, or just have a new life. but it's a great place for the King of England to put people that are causing problems at home, far away where they can't do any harm. So Lord Baltimore, Cecil Calvert, hence Baltimore, they found the colony of Maryland. Maryland is the first colony explicitly established with the idea of universal religious toleration. Remember, those Calvinists came over for religious freedom, but they came over for their own religious freedom. It wasn't a principle for them. They didn't believe everybody should be free to practice whatever religion they wanted in their own colony. Remember, Roger Williams, they kicked him out for saying that. But Maryland is founded as a place where everybody can practice whatever religion they want. Now, Catholics are never a majority of the population. And eventually, at one point, some Calvinists do get in charge, start persecuting everybody. But for the most part, this idea of religious tolerance, that's going to be the future in America. These sectarian differences over time are going to be smoothed out. So just know, Maryland, 1632, is founded as a settlement for religious freedom, religious toleration. To the west of New England, where we talked about those Dutch. The Dutch are active there. And as you can see, the Dutch are settling up the Hudson River, and the English are settling along the coast. The Dutch are pushing north, the English are pushing west. So very clearly, these people are going to end up in conflict. They're going to run into each other. Now, the Dutch aren't really trying to settle the New World en masse the way the English people are. The Dutch are mainly there for business reasons, especially the fur trade. Beaver pelts are very valuable back in Europe for hats and stuff. So the Dutch set up shop. They trade with the Indians for beaver pelts. They give the Indians things they want, like guns and iron tools, things like that. But of course, now the English are kind of horning in on their racket. Well, back in Europe, the English and Dutch go to war. And to simplify again, at the end of that war, the English end up in control of the entire Dutch settlement in the New World. It was called New Netherland, with its capital right there of New Amsterdam, and they end up changing that from to New York after the king's brother, James, Duke of York, who's also the Duke of Albany, so they can get Albany, New York, up further north. Only little hints of that Dutch heritage remain today. New York Knicks, Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker's kind of like a Dutch word for good old boy or regular guy or something like that. Bedford Stuyvesant, some of these Dutch names. The older families like the Roosevelts, these Dutch names. But most of that Dutch heritage is kind of gone now. New York, then and now, is a polyglot place. There's lots of different people coming in. Even at this time, it's a major center of trade, and the New York colony is vitally important to later American life. In fact, at one point, it actually becomes the capital for a minute. So. To the south of New York, we get another colony. Remember I talked about America being a dumping ground for all these people that the English just don't want around. Well, one of these groups is known as the Society of Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers. Now, these people have taken the logic of that Calvinism even further. They've said, well, if you're saved or dead no matter what you do, then really you don't even need the Bible, really, or ministers or anything. And so these friends would have these meetings, their friend meeting houses, where they all kind of stand together and kind of meditate until they felt the Holy Spirit and then shake, and hence Quakers. They believed in absolute equality, and they were total pacifists, which made everybody hate them. And so they're persecuted in England, and despite the fact that some of them are very rich. One of these rich Quaker families has loaned the King of England a bunch of money. The representative of that family goes to the king and says, hey, need my money back. And the king says, well, I don't have a lot of money, but I have a lot of America. How about some of that? And so basically he gives this guy, William Penn, a big chunk of land. Now understand, this colony is his. It's his family's personal property. And he names it Pennsylvania, literally Penn's Forest or Penn's Woods. William Penn goes over. He founds the City of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia, right here at the mouth of the Delaware River. And Pennsylvania, again, religious toleration, kind of like Maryland. William Penn famously is a fair dealer with the Indians. He actually buys the land as opposed to just ripping them off like everybody else was. Pennsylvania, another very important place. Philadelphia becomes the largest city in colonial America by far. It is extremely important. We're going to see Philadelphia come up when we talk about the Revolution over and over again. Moving back to the South, we talked about the Caribbean. We talked about how everybody's moving over there and they're planting sugar and tobacco. Well, these islands get pretty crowded. And you run into a problem with economy of scale. See, the equipment I need to have a sugar plantation is the same equipment whether I have 20 acres or 2,000 acres. I need the grinders, I need staff of slaves, all that stuff. So the larger the farm you can have, the more money you're going to make. Two guys with 50 acres each aren't going to make as much as one guy with 100 acres due to the investment in equipment and labor force and everything like that you're going to have. So everybody's coming out there and the farms are small, nobody's making as much money as they could. Well, some of these guys get the idea, hey, I know, let's go to the Americas, let's go west, and set up shop around the same latitude where we should be able to grow sugar there. And again, I'm simplifying. There were a lot of actual other people that came over to the Carolinas, but just simplified. So these guys land in what's today the area around Charlestown, and they try to set up sugar plantations. This doesn't work. Sugar doesn't actually grow very well there. They do figure out, though, there are things that do grow well there. Indigo and rice. Everybody knows from South Carolina history, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, pioneers indigo growing and all that. So they discover those two things grow. Of course, indigo is used for blue dye for clothes, very valuable. Please understand this, though, about the Carolinas. And eventually, the Carolinas in 1712 split off into North and South. They actually have different economies. South Carolina, the slavery there comes direct culturally from the Caribbean. Of all the colonies, slavery is most important in South Carolina. Slavery is so important, there's actually for a while a black majority in South Carolina. There's a really good book about it called Black Majority. So because it's this Caribbean-style slavery, we talked about how harsh that is, and because it's so important to their economy, South Carolina becomes the most radical slave ideology state. As we see the transition, we're going to see from slavery being a necessary evil to being, John C. Calhoun's phrase, a positive good. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. We're going to see how South Carolina becomes the capital of this right to own slaves ideology. Just like we're going to see later on, Boston becomes the heartland of abolitionism and radical getting rid of slavery ideology. So understand that. We're going to, like I said, as we move along, when we talk about Civil War, it's going to come back to Boston, it's going to come back to Massachusetts, and it's going to come back to South Carolina over and over again, those two. Last but not least among our colonies is Georgia. Georgia is founded after all of them. It's the last founded colony, 1732. It's founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe was a general. He fought all over Europe, gets very wealthy, and in his retirement decides to become a philanthropist. He wants to help people out. England is full of people in debtor's prison. Back then, if you owed somebody money, you couldn't pay, threw you in prison until somebody in your family coughed up the money. Oglethorpe is distressed by this. He says, oh, these people, they could be useful somewhere else. If they just get them out of debtor's prison, give them another chance, they could do something. So he hatches this scheme to send a bunch of debtors to the colony, or to some territory just south of South Carolina. It's actually disputed between the Spanish, who of course control Florida, where exactly the border is. So the colony will serve two purposes. One, it'll be a military post. They're out here basically creating a buffer between the very valuable plantations in South Carolina and Spanish territories in Florida. But also, like Oglethorpe said, it'll be a place to give these people a fresh start. And what will that fresh start be? Growing mulberry trees. Why do you want mulberry trees? Well, there's a type of moth that lays its eggs on mulberry leaves. Those moth eggs hatch, and they turn little caterpillars. We all know how that, they're in fourth grade biology about, life cycle of insects. And the caterpillars eat the mulberry leaves, and then they spin their cocoons. Now, those cocoons are very valuable, because you take those cocoons, you boil them down, and you unwind them. And what you end up with is silk thread. So they're trying to start silk production in America. And Oglethorpe's very particular about this, is we're going to plant mulberry trees, there's going to be no slaves, no rum, and no lawyers. That doesn't last at all. Mulberry trees don't grow very well. They're too close to South Carolina to not have slavery. So when they bring in the slavery, of course, Rome was probably there from the beginning. And then once you got those things, you get lawyers. So Oglethorpe's dream of that dies off. And it's actually, I should say, not altogether clear how many of these people were actually debtors to begin with. The common understanding of Georgia is that it was this debtor settlement, but it's not entirely clear that everybody that came over was debtors, although that was the impression we're going to see later when we talk about Ben Franklin and George Whitefield. So Georgia, Oglethorpe had a dream of Georgia as this redemptive place where poor people could, build their lives back and no more slavery, and then that just died. Georgia becomes a pretty typical Southern colony. You get some, and by the way, guys, notice when I talk about slavery, I've talked about tobacco, I've talked about sugar, I've talked about rice, I've talked about indigo. I haven't mentioned cotton. Cotton production does not become a major part of plantation agriculture until much later on. And now there is Sea Island cotton. You do get that on the coast of Georgia and stuff like that. But the cotton that grows further inland, not a factor yet. Georgia also, in addition to producing the staple stuff like rice, things like that you get in South Carolina, also produces a lot of naval stores. South Georgia's full of pine trees. You get the tars used to waterproof ships and things like that. Wood. And Georgia's got a lot of stuff. But just understand that about Georgia was supposed to be this, redemptive utopian community, as it were, and ended up being just like a southern colony. So that's your 13 colonies, established one after another, each with its own character, each with its own history, and these colonies each has its own identity. They don't share yet any common sense of Americanness. The shift from I am a South Carolinian, I am a Georgian, to having this kind of identity of I'm a South Carolinian, but I'm also an American, or I'm more importantly an American. That's going to come later. Over the course of the 1700s, that's where you're going to see the shift. From people developing not this, I'm an English person, but I'm an American. And that shift is important because until that happens, you don't get a revolution, you don't get independence. Next time we talk, we're going to talk about two pivotal events that contribute to that sense of Americanness. The French and Indian War and the First Great Awakening. Both these are pan-colonial events, and they involve everybody kind of getting together. So we'll talk about that shift to Americanness next time. After that, we're going to talk about the lead up to the Revolution as a consequence of the French and Indian War, and then we're going to get to the Revolutionary War itself. I've had fun with this. I hope you have too. I will see you all next time. Goodbye. On behalf of Great Collegiate Academy, thank you for watching.